Welcome everybody to the Synthetic Biology webinar on food and beverage. I'm John Cumbers, the founder and the CEO of SynBioBeta, and we're joined today by Mark Bünger, who is the CEO and the founder of Innovation Lab. Today's webinar is all about food and beverages, where chemistry, culture, and commerce combine. Mark, over to you.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much. And morning, everybody. So synthetic biology is one of these application areas that has a lot of different industries that it can fit into, but food and beverage happens to be one where it's a really, really nice fit. And I hope over the next 30 minutes or so, we'll be able to walk through that and talk about exactly why that is, and hopefully identify some opportunities for you, whether you're in the food industry now or you're a developer in synthetic biology and looking for some opportunities there. So we usually start out with just a basic market overview, talk about what's going on in the industry, again, for those who aren't totally acquainted with it, and even for some who are. The food industry is one of the largest in the world, if not the largest on the planet. Globally, it's about a $9 trillion market. There's a lot of range in that. Some estimates come in a little bit lower, say 7 or 8, some much higher, 11, even 15. And there's some reasons for that I'll touch on in just a second. But suffice it to say that, one, it's a very large market. Two, it's very hard to size precisely, and that's an inherent property of the way we make and consume food. But it's growing very rapidly as the world population gets more and more affluent. A lot of the things that we want to spend our money on is food. So within that, 6 to 9% growth rate, there are some segments that are growing really rapidly. For example, organic in developed markets is really growing. Meat in non-developing markets is also, or rather developing markets is also growing. And what we see with some of the things that we kind of prize as, again, developed market consumers, like again, organic and stuff like that, is that even though they're growing rapidly, they're still a very, very small base. And as they are right now, they're insufficient. The traditional agricultural methods and products that we have are really insufficient to feed the world. As much as we dislike processed food and industrial agriculture, or at least we say we do, that's definitely going to be a big part of bringing more food prosperity to the rest of the world. Breaking that down, that overall large and growing market, into some markets and segments, one of the ways that the food industry looks at itself is with different categories. So, for example, you've got dairy, meat, fruit and vegetables, which are also categories in themselves, grains, and then the products that come from those things. There are also segments like candy, and within food and beverage, you've got alcoholic beverages and so on and so forth. So the industry really thinks of itself in terms of products, and a lot of its major brands are really segmented that way too. So you'll have a company, for example, like AB InBev, that does mostly alcoholic beverages. Sometimes they'll get into something adjacent like snacks, but you rarely see, for example, a dairy provider also selling something like beer. So those categories are really based on the agricultural background, and then the process that turns animal and natural products into various end products. Another thing is regionally, obviously there are huge differences. This has to do somewhat with demographics and economics and things like that, but then there are also cultural reasons why certain foods are preferred in one place or another. And then finally, one of the most important areas, and I think we'll touch on this one again too, is behavioral. And probably the easiest way to think about behavioral things is, if you're going to have dinner, do you make it at home, or do you order it from a restaurant, or do you go to a restaurant? So those are three very different ways to get the same thing. And right now, a lot of innovation in the food industry is around precisely this, about basically shifting a lot of what we used to make at home into things that we order or we go out for. And again, we'll touch back on that. So with that kind of overview of what is a very fragmented and highly diverse market, this brings us back to why this is a hard market to size. Unlike, for example, automotive, where you know exactly how many cars are produced in how many factories all over the world, food is very, very local, both in its production and in its consumption. And so there's no way really for standard market research techniques to go and measure all the value of small farms and the meals that somebody might cook for their family or might cook for friends, and things like that. So we don't actually even try to get too detailed, but what we do look at what are the trends and the changes, again, like I said, in behavior that could lead to some future opportunities. So to do that, we can look at some of the supply chain and the key companies, and this is where we'll start to see where synthetic biology fits in. So as a framework to look at the challenges and the constraints that face the food industry, this model, I think, does it pretty well. So there are the 3 E's on the outside: the economics, the environmental, health and safety and security, and then the ethics of food. These are all things that mostly constrain food production and food consumption. And you can probably think of some examples of how that happens. But then you've got the core innovation. We really, although we all have a fondness for traditional foods, especially around holidays and things like that, there's also a huge drive in food innovation. And this innovation is, it really has to work together with the 3 E constraints on the outside. So to define these a bit more precisely, in economics, you've got things like seasonality. There's almost no other industry in the world where you've got billions and billions of dollars that you have to harvest at one particular month of the year, and that's it. That's your only opportunity. The weather doesn't bend to our needs, and some growing seasons just are what they are. That means that there's a lot of up and down in supply, which doesn't always match what's going on in demand. So because of that, you've got people who are always trying to speculate and price the commodities. Are they going to be in oversupply or undersupply this year? And that's based both on how much is coming out of fields, but also how much consumers are going to be demanding. That also changes. So for example, we have long-term shifts in demand for things like meat and milk. Over time, in the Western world, the interest in those things has been declining. So commodity buyers and sellers have to look for other markets for those things, just because consumer preferences are shifting due to health concerns and stuff like that. That leads again to distribution and retail. How do you get products from one place where they're grown to another place where they're going to be consumed? Because a lot of foods, in fact, most foods, are perishable in some way. So obviously meats and dairy and things like that need to be kept cold. Grains can be stored for longer, but they also have a certain shelf life. So that leads to retail and the types of things that we see there, where when you go to your grocery store, they've got promotions, they've got marketing and things like that to try and get you to buy the things that they bought. And when that doesn't work, they end up having to throw things away. So food waste, as we'll see in a number of places, is a huge problem. About 30 to 40, maybe even 50% of the food that we produce is lost somewhere between coming out of the ground and going back into the trash and into the ground again. Other things in the economics are the production of food, the process around that, labor, the ingredients that go into it, things like sweeteners and preservatives, those all cost money. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there are shifting consumer preferences. So you have things that are maybe seasonal. So we all are getting ready in the United States to see a lot of advertisements for things with pumpkin spice flavoring because it's Halloween and Thanksgiving coming up. So those preferences are also something that need to basically be taken into account when we think about producing, storing, and selling food. On the environmental, health, safety, and security, these are all issues that we see in a lot of industries, but in food, they are not just about the workers, they're also about the people consuming the product. So there's a lot of talk right now about the environmental impact of agriculture, in particular meat. Because of the amount of water it requires and land, the amount of methane and other greenhouse gases that it produces. Health is a big issue, again, not just for the workers. The conditions for for food workers are often not the best. These are some of the lowest paid jobs in most of the world, even in developing economies. But then also the health of the animals and the health of the consumers. Is this food going to make us sick? These are all big questions. That leads into food safety. So again, we need to make sure that ingredients are unadulterated and that things are being kept cold if they need to. A related but different topic is food security. And this is basically, is there going to be enough food in the future for the growing population of a given area? Right now, we actually have more food than we need. We just happen to throw away a lot of it. But if climate change really kicks in, a lot of the places where people live and where people grow food are going to change, and it's not certain that we'll have access to food in the future. Finally, there's the ethics. As I mentioned, treatment of animals. If you're a vegan, you don't even want animals to be caged and pent up and be producing milk and eggs for you. Anything that restricts an animal's freedom is bad. Vegetarians accept those things, but they don't accept that animals are killed, and so on. You get more and more variations like kosher and halal, and basically the way animals are treated. We have a lot of moral and ethical rules around that. I mentioned workers' conditions are generally bad, and in some cases they are the meat packing plants and things like that. They're very dangerous. Some of the most dangerous places you can work. So the question is, can synthetic biology address some of these things? Communications with customers, that basically comes down to how we do we declare what is in food. There's a lot of talk about labeling, especially when things are genetically modified. That implies that they are harmful if you label something, and so if they are not, which the scientific consensus is that genetic modification is not a harmful practice to the environment or to the health of consumers, as long as all of their health and safety tests are passed, then putting labels on products is actually a confusing thing. So with all these constraints, then you get down to what most industries care about, which is the core product innovation. And so that's, how do we make things tastier? How do we make them less expensive? What are some food trends? So things like, acai berry or wheatgrass or pomegranate or cupcakes. These are all food trends that in the food industry can be billions of dollars. And so food industry people are very, very concerned and paying a lot of attention to those. And then finally, there's things like packaging, delivery, and consumption. We don't think of those as food innovations. They're innovations around the food, but these are all really big drivers of how we what we choose to buy and how the market for food rolls out. So there's a pretty interesting example in the United States. Probably 20 years ago, there was a campaign that the milk producers started called Got Milk, and it was very confusing. It's a little bit weird. It didn't really move the needle on selling more milk, but it did actually become this iconic campaign, even though it didn't sell a lot of milk. What did sell a lot of milk, though, is what are called milk chugs. These are these basically wide-mouth plastic bottles, single-use plastic bottles, but they basically make it a lot easier and more convenient to take milk along with you than the paper carton containers that they replaced. So all these types of innovations, in and around the product are important too. So that's kind of an overview of the industry itself. If we dive down into some of the specific challenges that synthetic biology can help address, the supply chain is really a good framework for looking at this. So as I mentioned earlier, despite globalization, the consolidation that we hear about in food, industrialization of agriculture, the food and beverage supply chain is still very long, it's still very complex and very fragmented. You have tens or even hundreds of thousands of suppliers and buyers, even in a really, let's say, a U.S. state or a small or medium-sized country. There's not a lot of other industries that have that type of widespread distribution. And all the steps in between, like I said, are also very, very fragmented. And at just about every step from, pouring fertilizer and pesticides on plants on the ground to animals eating them, rendering those animals, making them into products, combining them with other types of ingredients, bringing them to a store, packaging them up and selling them to consumer, and then disposing of them. There are steps where synthetic biology fits in really well. So if we want to look at what some of those bigger companies are, I think this is important, especially if you are in synthetic biology and looking to enter the market. It's very hard to do this on a grassroots level, no pun intended, because the equipment and the techniques used in synthetic biology in any space, especially in food though, tend to favor larger scale production. So just to give you a look at the Fortune 2000, these are the largest companies in the world by revenue and market size and so on. You see something really interesting when you look at the food processing versus the food retail groups. So on this chart on the left, the far left column or far left axis is the number of companies of those 2,000 that are in food processing versus food retail. So you can see it's about 42, 43 in food processing and about 32 in food retail. But if you look at their sales in billions of dollars, that's the right-hand axis of this chart, you can see that the retailers actually sell quite a lot more despite there being fewer of them. And so this is really interesting. It says a lot about basically the markups as you go along the food supply chain. The other thing that's really interesting, though, is when you look at factors like the value of the assets that these companies have. Retailers have almost no assets. So storefronts, they often even lease, whereas food processing, you own land, you own factories, you own means of production. So you have a lot of capital. So the capital valuation of food processing companies tends to be a lot higher. The irony here with retail is that because retail as a category outside of food is just kind of a huge crisis right now. Malls are being shuttered, stores are closing. It's not just record stores and bookstores, clothing stores and everything else is going down too. The one type of retail that actually can save those is food retail. So having the right type of restaurant in your food court at your mall is actually one of the ways that the other retailers are turning things around. So looking for innovative food retailers is a good channel to market for anybody in food, but for synthetic biology in particular. So this pretty complicated chart is another look at that same value chain, the simplified one that I showed you before. This one shows the uses of energy. It happens to be for Switzerland, so the numbers are specific to that that country. They're in terajoules, but what I want to point out here is really where the flow is and where the ancillary and losses go. So across the top, you see the green arrow going from crop production to post-harvest handling and trade, then from there to processing and so on. So that green line is basically the line of the energy contained from crop production all the way to consumption at the end on the right. The big red arrow at the bottom, as you see, is just about the same magnitude as the production from crops into animals. That red arrow is basically losses consumed by neither animals nor humans. So this is one example of the type of waste that we see in the food industry. We also see a lot of water usage and as we'll see in a second, CO2 production. This is largely because a lot of the food material, the biomass that we produce, just gets spoiled, broken, lost, or damaged somewhere along the chain. So we produce a lot more than we need, and if through genetic engineering, through food safety testing, through other things that synthetic biology can help out with, we could turn this around. It would really help the environmental and economic impacts of food a lot. So we hear a lot about the environmental impact of meat production. So methane produced by cows and pigs, as well as all the food that they eat and the water that takes, has a huge environmental impact. And if you just look at the CO2, this chart basically shows the kilograms of CO2 emitted for the per kilogram of product. So for 1 kilo of lamb, you're going to have production emissions of about 35 kilos, and then another roughly 5 kilos of post-farm gate emissions, so processing, transport, and so on. But you can see from this chart, just growing animals takes an enormous amount of resources and produces an enormous amount of CO2. So you might think that that's meat, but if you go down the line to towards the right, you start getting into nuts and broccoli and things like that. So even broccoli produces about 2 kilos of CO2 for every kilo of broccoli that we produce. As I said, a lot of food, up to half of it, is wasted at some point along the value chain, but by using synthetic biology, we can, one, prevent the waste from happening in the first place. This is what a lot of cellular agriculture, in other words, growing meat in a petri dish or in a lab, as opposed to growing an entire animal, and then, using, say, 20% of that animal's mass and throwing the rest away. One way is just by only growing what we need, preventing the waste in the first place. We can also divert some of that waste, so things that might be byproducts of one process can be shunted off into another. And then we can also use food waste as a biomass source. For example, feeding it to microbes, turning that into single-celled proteins, and that protein becomes feed for another generation of food. So these are just some ideas, but I think if there's one takeaway I want to give you for this entire presentation, is this. Synthetic biology has the potential to be the best of both worlds. The traditional food, the things that we like to eat, that, fresh fruits and vegetables, meat, dairy, and things like that we think taste really good, but that are really difficult for the entire world to enjoy because of the environmental and economic cost. Processed foods are cheap. They don't always taste as good, but synthetic biology has the potential, at least, to provide the health and natural ingredients of traditional food at the low cost and scale of processed foods. So if we think of that green box of synthetic biology as there's something inside that, I want to break that down just a little bit to give you some specific ideas about where that might be. So if you look inside this box of synthetic biology and how it fits into food, this is kind of a diagram showing on the vertical axis what part of an organism are we talking about. The top, we've got herds and flocks and swarms, so ecosystems basically of many organisms living together. Then there are whole organisms. Those are made of tissues. The tissues are made of cells. Those cells contain biomolecules. And then there are things that are not material but functions that biology provides. So synthetic biology has a role to play up and down all of those. And then if you look at what kind of organism, the kingdom of microbes and plants and animals are the main part of this, but there's also, again, there's sub organisms, sort of, biomolecule level things, and then there's things where we have entire groups of ecosystems of organisms. So what we focused on in this report, even though all those areas out to the edge are possible applications for synthetic biology, is the food itself. And so that basically boils down to what we're calling acellular products. That is the proteins and small molecules that are produced by cells. Single cell proteins, so these are generally microorganisms that are grown in large amounts and used as feed or directly as food for humans. Clean meat, which is the sort of the in vitro, burgers that we've heard so much about. There's a lot of going on in that space. And then also entire plants, animals, both land and sea, that people are developing, and even mushrooms. CRISPR-treated mushroom was approved by the FDA in 2016. So there's that as well. And then there's enabling technologies that cut across all these. So within this space, like I said, there's a lot of opportunity for companies in synthetic biology or companies in food to find solutions around these things. But I wanted to dive down into the clean meat, single cell protein, and acellular products. These are things, spaces where we see startups coming to market right now. They're bringing products that, if they're not already on shelves, will be in the next 3 or 4 years. So the in vitro meat that we've heard so much about is finally getting to a place where we can, normal people can afford to eat it. So starting at the bottom there with acellular products, are also called acellular agriculture. This is basically engineered organisms, usually microorganisms like bacteria or yeast, that produce a flavor or a sweetener or a nutrient that we typically would have gotten from an animal or a plant. But because those products are molecules, they're not cells, they can actually be certified just like any other ingredient, regardless of its origin, at least in some countries, without being treated as genetically modified food. So in the United States, for example, the Impossible Foods burger that is all over the place at this point, even at Burger King, uses heme. That's basically the molecule that helps our blood transport energy and oxygen, and gives it its red color. That is used in that they manufacture that in microbes and then use that in the Impossible Burger to give it the taste and the color of pink red meat. Cargill also has a product called Eversweet. It's basically stevia, but it's sweeter and and better than the natural variety, because there are certain versions of the molecules that make up stevia that are more sweet, and it is the microbes are engineered to produce those exclusively. So there's a lot going on in this space, and this is probably one of the, like I said, this is an area where you can already see products that are out on the market. This is just a little note about the Cargill thing. So Reb-M and Reb-D, those are the two versions of the molecules I mentioned, have significantly more sweetness and less bitterness at high usage levels than the traditional Reb-A, which is the one that you'd find naturally. So basically, this is from Cargill saying that not only do we get a better product because it's sweeter, but in their initial evaluation, it also shows that producing it with microbes via fermentation uses significantly less land and emits significantly less CO2 than doing it by growing acres and acres of plants. Another space is this thing called cell protein. So as I mentioned, these are basically edible biomass from microorganisms like algae and yeast and fungi. There are a lot of ways to basically to treat this. Sometimes you extract the protein afterwards. Sometimes you eat the entire biomass. But there's some really interesting companies in this space. So the range here is pretty broad. One of the ones I wanted to point out is Callista. So Callista is basically using microbes that have been engineered to consume natural gas and then turn that into food ingredients. So you wouldn't eat them yourself, but these are used for animal feed, and a lot of these companies are doing exactly that. There's a limited market for humans to eat these single cell proteins, but for animals, it's a great feed additive. And then we get to kind of the star of the show right now. This is the thing that everyone's talking about: clean meat and clean seafood. This is meat that's grown in cell culture from a sample that's taken from an animal rather than in an animal's body. This is again, this kind of iconic, $325,000 lab-grown burger. That was 2013. By 2021, they expect to be out on the market at the latest, actually, with that burger at a price that most of us can afford. What's probably most exciting about this space, in addition to the environmental and economic benefits that it could bring if more and more people around the world are eating meat, is the ethical one. So you don't have to be a complete animal lover to realize that we're slaughtering hundreds of billions of animals a year, about 100 to 150 billion animals a year, and so the toll, I think, of raising that is becoming more and more apparent. One of the studies that we looked at for this report found that 25% of American millennials consider themselves vegan or vegetarian, and that's a number that's strongly growing. So the same way a lot of other human rights and ethical rights issues have come to the forefront with generations in the past, this could be the one where the last generation that really views eating meat from formerly live animals is acceptable. We'll see where that goes. So we've had kind of a deep dive into various aspects of the food industry, as well as in the synthetic biology community and synthetic biology field. So as these start coming together over the next years, what are some of the things that could come next? So on the left-hand side, some of the positive things. On the right-hand side, some things that could be challenges. First of all, right now we're definitely in a novelty phase where we have high prices and probably high margins, and that's going to be good for fueling further research. It can really fulfill the promise of not only new and interesting, but sustainable and tasty and good foods. That will lead to more and more innovation in synthetic biology-based food. And then I've written something. This is a little bit of sort of business speak, MBA speak, but substitutable meals become a competitive space. By that I mean when the things we normally choose food based on, like taste and price and health, those are our main ingredients, but we tend to let environmental aspects go by the wayside. In the future, we might be able to do have our cake and eat it too, no pun intended, have basically foods that we're very excited about, think are new and novel and interesting, but that also have a much, much, much better environmental footprint. So substituting things is, one for the other is the new competitive space, not just price-based competition. On the potentially challenging side, things I think that we should all be looking out for. Regulations are really up in the air. So whenever new technologies come out, we see, sort of a first nothing and then a little bit of a battle about how that new thing should be regulated. So we could see both positive and negative regulations around SynBio foods. For example, there might be certain parts of the world or the country where synthetic biology is the only acceptable way to make certain types of foods. We see, a lot of overfishing. We see the impacts of beef production on the environment. And some places might say that only lab-grown meat is acceptable. You can't get another kind. So, for example, in California, you really would have a hard time finding bottled water compared to a few years ago. On the other hand, you've got places where things might be totally forbidding synthetic biology-based foods. So, in Europe, we have a lot of areas where even though a product or process is environmentally superior, because there's a lot of resistance to genetically modified organisms or other types of products that again fit into more technological field, the precautionary principle says you can't use those things. So that could happen as well. These things could be forbidden. One of the most important things, though, I think that's likely to happen is the rise of inexpensive copycats. So, we see this in a lot of fields. Even solar panels, for example, used to be, a very expensive product you could pretty much only get from a few German suppliers. But then when a market for something starts taking off and the technology gets more and more accessible, you see a lot of other companies jumping in. And so for the this, for example, lab-grown meat or other products, we could see a lot more producers basically coming in and making this extremely inexpensive. And maybe all the health that we have talked about goes away when people eat so much food, and because it's so inexpensive that we have a second obesity epidemic or something like that. But bringing this back around to things that could be positive and what could come out of this, when adoption of synthetic biology-based food has passed the majority, so probably 5, 10, 15 years from now, we'll have a new cycle of innovation. It might be in flavor, it might be in texture, it might be completely new foods that no one's ever had before, and that could be really exciting. We see these revolutions every so often when a new food enters the market, and then we all get this expansion in our range of things that we can choose from. And then finally, Mars. If you're looking to keep your Mars explorers happy and well fed, synthetic biology in food and other processes is going to be a key way to do that. So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to meeting you in the future.
Thank you, Mark. That was Mark Bünger from Innovation Lab, and you can download the full food tech report on our website next week. Thanks again for joining us for today's SynBioBeta webinar. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.